Hi, it's Ben Sommer. I don't usually do podcasts here on my personal channel, but about a month ago, I got an awesome opportunity to interview one of my idols, Ian Anderson. Of course, Ian is the main creative force behind the British band Jethro Tull. If you've never heard of Jethro Tull, then you're either living under a rock or under 18. Either way, I think it's very sad. But Ian's music that he wrote and recorded with the band is ubiquitous. It's been a classic rock mainstay for 40 plus years. And Ian was the first and really only guy to make flute a viable rock and roll instrument. So Ian's famous for a couple reasons. He's a great songwriter and performer, sold like over 50 million records, and he's got that flute gimmick to boot. Now, the first attempt at this interview, yes, there were more than one attempt, went horribly wrong, and so wrong that I wrote a blog about it. You can go look at it at bensummer.com/Anderson interview. That's Anderson interview, one word. It's just a funny story. T-minus 3 minutes to go. I had a technical difficulty. I was in a conference room at work trying to get a call going through Skype and record it, and I fucking left a power strip at home. Canceled it, got it rescheduled. It's just a funny story. Go read that if you want. I didn't get to nearly all the questions I wanted to with Ian because I only had 15 minutes with him. But we did talk about the Aqualung remix that was released last year, remixed by the minor prog star Steve Wilson. A little shout out to those folks on Twitter who follow me and gave me some questions to ask Ian. Apologies to Mike Sargent, Shawlands, and Jay, who gave me some good questions, but I wasn't able to get to them. Probably the best one, if I had the balls and the time with Ian, would be to ask him when he will be returning his Grammy for Best Hard Rock Metal Performance. If you don't get that joke, then that only means you are not a Metallica fan and or not a Jethro Tull fan. Enough of me. Let's get to my completely unscripted and unedited interview with the great Ian Anderson. Hello?
Hello, this is Ian Anderson calling to do an interview.
Thank you. Welcome. This is Ben Sommer. Ian, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Great.
Far away.
Great. Just give me a sec. Well, I'm here with, to me, an idol and a legend, Ian Anderson, frontman for the classic prog band Jethro Tull. And it's been a busy couple years for you, Ian. You've got an important remix of Aqualung that came out, as well as Thick as a Brick 2. I'd like to tackle the Aqualung remix first. I wasn't sure what to expect when I heard it, but whether to expect a fully re-envisioned kind of creative remix, as I've seen the Beatles have had a couple of these types of albums come out. What I heard was a very measured, tasteful, kind of just very updated and modern sounding version of the classic album. Was that kind of your hope for it, or did you work with Steve Wilson, your mix engineer, to get that effect, or did you just drop it in his hands? I mean, how was the process?
Well, the process was, first of all, getting the original master tapes converted to 24-bit 96K digital audio, which was done in Abbey Road Studios, and luckily the tapes had survived pretty well over the years, although I did, about 10 years ago, make a backup analog copy of the master tapes because of concerns about how long they would survive, and also because felt that there was a likelihood there would be other audio formats that would benefit from having access to those master tracks, and so of course these days, yes, we have 5.1 surround mixes to do as well as the stereo mixes, and we placed that with Stephen Wilson, who first of all tried 2 or 3 tracks to see how he got on and how I liked his work, and we then proceeded to do the whole album, and then we moved pretty quickly on from doing that to doing the remix of Thick as a Brick, which was completed last year as well. I mean, the original album. And so Stephen has, I think, a natural deference when it comes to the general layout of the mix, the structure of positioning of instruments in the stereo field, the general sonic quality, but his job is there to try and more or less recreate the original balance, but to try and give it sonic clarity, a little bit more dynamics, a little more punch, a little more vigor, which I think he did very well.
Yeah, agreed. A couple of things that were hallmarks of that album. The middle slow section of Aqualung, where it's you against the acoustic guitar. I mean, he treated that traditionally. It was a very kind of far off, dry, kind of telephony reverb. That was treated respectfully, although I imagine he probably had the raw vocal track. Is that true to work with?
Yes, he would have had the raw vocal track to work with, but a lot of the things on both Aqualung and on Thick as a Brick were recorded with a certain quality or a certain effect added. So in some cases he would have had the option to change it a little bit. In some cases it was already embedded in the way that the music had been recorded. Because I'm one of those people who like to make decisions as I go along. I don't like to... There's a tradition, among certain American record producers simply to record everything flat with no EQ, no dynamics, no effects, nothing at all. Just record, just get the whole thing down, absolutely dry as a bone,
right.
and then turf the band out of the room, and then spend days playing around, adding things, changing the sounds of stuff, and that's not my approach at all. I conceive of the music in a certain way, and as I'm working on it, both in the writing, the arranging, and then the recording process, I'm defining the thing as I go along. So in many cases, I have a vision of how I want it to be, and I try and pursue that vision, not to the point of giving myself no options when it comes to mixing, but at least in a way reducing the options, because I think mixing should be pretty quick and pretty live and pretty spontaneous, and in a way you should record the album so that it's more or less like putting up the faders, and you've got all the dynamics and level changes. You've recorded them that way, So I've always been someone who liked to work in the studio with a monitor mix that was as close as possible to the final mix. I don't, every time I sit and listen to it, I'm making those fine adjustments in the monitor mix in the studio while we're working on the album, and so I'm kind of getting a feel for how I want it to sound at the end, and therefore tweaking things and making those little changes as we go along, so that when it comes to mixing, I don't want to spend more than 2 or 3 hours to mix a track, say 4 or 5 minutes of music, and in real terms, to do a full album like this, you're talking about 5 days' work, which is what it took me to do originally, what it took Stephen Wilson to do, and Thick as a Brick 2 was about 5 days in the mixing, although there were a few little things that he and I changed and worked on, and in the mastering process, of course, there's always a final little bit of technical jiggery-pokery just to get the thing in shape for its manufacture. But in all, everything went to plan and went pretty quickly, which is the way I like to work. I'm not one of those people who want to spend months just in the studio doing things and doing them again and remixing. I mean, that's just a pain in the arse. You go off the boil.
You do. And, you do. Do you think that has anything to do with your roots back before? This is probably, I think, more true back in the 60s and 70s. But bands were bands. They performed, they played, and they got a record deal and recorded something. When they got a break, because the technology was not there. And so, is it maybe because your vision of how music should be was formed by performing live, and so the recorded product, although sometimes you can get creative and go off the deep end, as you say, it's still more or less capturing a performance?
I think the original Thick as a Brick and Thick as a Brick 2 were both written certainly written, but particularly arranged in the way that they would be playable live. I think particularly due to the way in which they were written spontaneously, very quickly, and so when the band rehearsed them, they were rehearsed as live performances. It's just that with the original album, when I went into the studio, I did quite a few additional lines and overdubs and things that took my fancy. in the studio, which made it very difficult to finally play live in that form, because a lot of places the flute and the vocals are happening at the same time, and of course I can't do that live.
Right.
I need someone else to help me if we're going to exactly recreate that. So we have an additional musician or an additional performer on stage to allow me to and us collectively to recreate Figures of Brick 1 just the way it was on the record. But on Figures of Brick 2, I think there's only one note, one flute note coincides with a line of vocal, but I'm able to dodge that by just finishing a crotchet earlier and taking a very quick breath. So I didn't make the same mistakes when it came to doing the second one.
You can't snort out an overtone while you're singing?
Well, all of the problems of playing the flute anyway, so it's quite an aerobic exercise doing the 2-hour show, because I only have about 16 bars in the whole of Figures of Brick 1 and 2 when I'm not actually playing. So it's a pretty big feat for me.
Yeah.
I'm singing or playing guitar, and then the flute stuff, of course, is pretty demanding, because you've got to have quite a lot of wind power to get through all of that. So yeah, it's something that it does require certain physical condition to be able to do it, and mentally you've really got to be very, very focused to perform all of that. Not just me, all of the musicians. We spent a lot of time separately and together to get to that performance standard that we needed to achieve to be able to do it.
Right. I want to get to Figures of Brick 2, but first I want to talk to you about your process. Now, I'm a composer as well, and I want to know how you approach it. A couple basic questions. You can elaborate as you see fit. Do you compose on paper? Do you how did you learn the theoretical aspects of harmony, melody, rhythm, those things that you need to piece together your initial inspiration? Just give me a glimpse into your process, please.
Well, I don't really have a defined and regular way of working. I like to do things differently according to the task at hand, and I don't like a production methodology for making music. Sometimes it's might come from playing a monophonic instrument like a flute, and I'm just thinking of a melody or a motif, and then I build upon that. Sometimes it's lyrically, sometimes it's a title or just the subject material for a song. Sometimes you manage to do it all at the same time. It kind of runs concurrently, in terms of lyrical ideas, musical ideas, and sometimes it's just strumming a guitar and having an interesting chord sequence that suggests a melody. After having thought, well, that's kind of a nice little juxtaposition of chords and harmony, and the melody comes later. It comes sort of on the back of that. So it's different every time, and that's what I think is. It's the Kama Sutra of songwriting. I don't have one favorite position. I kind of like to vary it a little bit.
Got it. Do you write on paper? Notes and such.
No, I've always since I began playing music. I was just a self-taught musician who didn't read or write music, and although I speak the language of music and I have a broad understanding of the structure of music and the I suppose some of the formal nature of music, but I don't write the notes on a piece of paper. I've always really wanted to commit things to memory.
Right.
All the other guys in the band use written music to some extent, some a lot, and then they learn it once they've scored everything out. Mm. But for me, it's always really about trying to remember it, and if I can't remember it, then I figure it's probably not very good and not worth remembering.
Right. What about how did you? If you're self-taught, were you self-taught by practice, learning how harmony? What harmonies work, what conventions work and don't work? Did you learn it all by osmosis, by playing and experiencing it and seeing it? Did you mix that with any formal or other self learning? How did you understand, when to throw in a minor chord in a major key, or any of the kind of tricks that you learn in music school if you didn't study formally?
It's really just by listening to other kinds of music, not just contemporary pop or rock music, but listening to the music of many different cultures and different periods of time. So I suppose I've just drawn on a whole number of influences, but particularly when I was in my teens and early 20s. But I've always been a music listener, only from the point of view of trying to learn something from it. I don't listen recreationally to music. I'm not one of those people who sits plugged into my iPod or cell phone or whatever, just to while away the hours in travel or whatever. And I hate to have music on when I'm sitting in a car traveling, because I hate to have music fighting through the sound of wind and noise and engines and car noise and tire noise and all the rest of it. Is just, to me, really something I don't want to do. I think if you're going to sit and listen to music, you should do it with complete concentration and commitment as a listener, and it's not convenient for me to do that very often. Most of the time anyway, I'm more interested in playing music than I am in listening to other people's. And I think probably by the time I was in my early 20s, my hours spent listening to other people's music had dwindled to very, very little. And I've never really maintained a record collection. I mean, sure, I've probably got a few thousand songs that are audio files somewhere on my computers and so on, but it's kind of nice to have them, but I certainly never felt it necessary in my life to have shelves full of vinyl albums or cassettes or CDs. Right. It's just clutter around the house. I mean, I have quite a lot of CDs and DVDs and various things on bookshelves, but they're actually all my own work, because they're either references or they're things that are kept for promotional purposes, or or Christmas gifts for people who I don't like very much. And please don't be offended, but I have to move on to my next interview, because we've done our allotted span.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Ian, and best of luck in the new album, and hopefully we'll talk again next time.
Well, I hope so. Thanks very much. Good to talk to you.
You too.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.